today are Allison Petroziello. I'm going to mess up everyone's names. I apologize in advance. An accomplished doctoral candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University. Our second speaker will be Alexandre Charette, who is a postdoctoral fellow from Concordia University. And then we will hear from Professor Rupalim Bhuyan from social work at U of T. Rupalim is well known as an advocate for immigrant women. She's done a lot of work on immigrant women and domestic violence, for example. And then Tenzin Shim, who is an activist in the Tibetan community and a research assistant at University of Toronto. And Professor Jenna Henneberry from sociology at Wilfrid Laurier, and who also has a long list of other titles and roles that I'm not going to repeat right now, but who is also involved in advocacy, particularly for migrant workers, is going to make some remarks. So the way we're going to organize this, we're going to have the speakers one after the other. Then we're going to have questions and answers at the end. Please put your questions in the chat and your comments. And please turn off your phones, or at least turn off the noise from your phones. And for those of you who don't want your image to be shown, we are going to record the presentations, but you should shut down your camera if you don't want your image to appear in the recording. Okay, so without more ado, I would like to begin. Allison is going to talk about a gender-based approach to settlement, emphasizing the reasons why gender matters. So Allison.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. So I have been collaborating with the BMRC partnership through the Kitchener-Waterloo City Network for the last 3 years in collaboration with our 3 co-PIs and my co-author, Jenna Henneberry, and the other 2 are Dr. Margaret Walton-Roberts and Tara Bedard of our local immigration partnership. So our research aims to understand the relationship between gender and resilience amongst migrants with a temporary permit or who are seeking asylum in the region of Waterloo. So I added a few words to my title. We're taking a gender-based approach to settlement and integration support because I'm trying to flag that the way in which we are speaking about settlement services actually includes both informal and formal immigrant service providers and other community-based organizations that are serving migrants, including temporary migrants who may face barriers to eligibility to the formal settlement services. So as an overview of the talk today, we found that gender has a bearing on migrants' entry to Canada, their access to services, and how they cope with integration challenges. And the Government of Canada has committed to conducting gender-based analysis in policy and programming, a position reaffirmed as it championed gender responsiveness in the negotiations leading up to Canada's adoption of the Global Compact for Migration. So we ask, how well do these commitments translate to settlement work and integration support at the local level? So our research moves from high-level considerations of gender responsiveness in migration governance to consider its local application in the region of Waterloo, Ontario. So in the allotted time today, I will offer a few examples of the gendered realities and challenges facing migrants in our region, as well as some of the creative ways in which immigrant serving and other community organizations are seeking to address them. And then I'll conclude by offering some considerations for strengthening a gender-based approach to settlement. So here, just a quick overview of the methods. Our research team based at the International Migration Research Center carried out several workshops with community organizations that are serving temporary migrants and refugee claimants. Some of you were here with us in Waterloo a few years ago now. We also had another one on gender, sexuality, and refuge through a Laurier event. We conducted focus groups and semi-structured interviews with more than 70 migrants and interviews with more than 20 service providers. And so we had this focus on both the service providers and the migrants because we understand resilience as emerging at the intersection between individual and family capacity to respond to the challenges of migration and settlement, and institutional and community capacity to provide supports that foster newcomer resilience and respond to change. So what are some of the gendered realities that have come up in our research? We have flagged in other places as well that there are structural gender inequalities and that there may be fewer pathways available or accessible for women, relegating more of them to temporary categories. And I'll offer an example of this in the following slides. We find that temporary migrants may not be eligible for different kinds of social supports, including settlement support, childcare subsidy, and there are some delays in eligibility for child tax benefit. My apologies for my children in the background talking about gender-based constraints. Gender-based violence is also a cause of migration and experienced during and after migration for several participants who also shared experiences where frustrated male partners who had become violent or had abandoned their spouse and gone back to their country of origin. We heard accounts of parents fearing being reported to Family and Children's Services. And in fact, one of the claimants I interviewed was reported as she was chasing her child with autism down the street and screaming to keep them from being hit by a car. And so then ends up getting reported. In terms of language acquisition, there may be gender differences in the rate or the pace at which women are able to learn English or French. Yet it is women, especially mothers, who are interacting with Canadian institutions through the schools, through doctor's visits, meeting with social workers, etc. There are also gender constraints around access to healthcare, and particularly sexual and reproductive health services, as well as issues around access to work, women being de-skilled, channeled into care work, housekeeping, etc. And then a lot of these challenges that face all migrants are compounded by risks of homelessness, food insecurity, and social isolation. So I wanted to offer just a few examples, if I can get the slide to move. One second. So here we have an example that illustrates some of the gendered experiences pre-migration and also the decision-making regarding pathways. And the yellow highlighting refers to a challenge faced, whereas the green highlighting refers to migrant agency or a coping strategy that's indicative of her resilience. So N, who's a computer engineer, has come to Kitchener to do a graduate certificate, and she is from Iran and she's widowed. So she tells us about losing her husband 2 years ago and being in shock and thinking about making a new life for herself. And she recognizes that, okay, in Iran, in her words, my child will have no rights just like me and all the women in Iran. I do not want my child to be raised in a conservative country or to endure the embarrassing or disappointing little things after the loss of my husband. And so assessing her options, she says, I thought, okay, I know a little bit of English. I should go to some schools to remember more. I searched about so many places and thought that Canada is good because of the good communities. It's an English-speaking country, and then immigration is possible, unlike the US right now. And so she asked a lot of different people about going to Canada and says, all the doors were closed to me except coming in as an international student. So no refugee, no tourist, and no express entry. The only choice was this one. I thought, I'm a little too old for this, but I said to myself, this is not a bad opportunity for me to be upgraded a bit. The next example is also a graduate student who's from Nigeria and is a mother of 4. And so this is an example of someone with some needs and challenges that go beyond the supports offered by the university's International Students Office. So she says, I wanted my husband to come also, but I got my study permit earlier and he didn't get his work permit until 6 months after. The situation was stressful and difficult without my husband. For me, going back home to Nigeria was not an option as I had come here to study. The financial challenges, lack of good job opportunities were factors that did not appeal to my husband to live in Canada. He has his own business back home and is a professional. When he came to the House of Friendship and saw the food banks, he found it very difficult. It hurt his pride. Now I am here in Canada alone with 4 children trying to balance life with my PhD studies, and it is very challenging, especially with one who has special needs. So Kay has been able to access some support through a community organization's family outreach program and also through the YMCA. However, the community organization reported to us in our interviews with them that they had been debating internally whether their limited resources should go to supporting international students who've had to show that they have resources to support themselves in order to obtain a study permit to come to Canada in the first place. It should also be noted that the profile of international students is changing, with many more people, especially women, opting for this pathway to come to Canada, especially because it's perceived as more readily accessible. And I know we'll be talking about that in future webinars. So this is how we're thinking about gender responsiveness, now kind of shifting to a support and organization perspective. Our research aimed to understand if and to what extent gender responsiveness was part of integration programming. And as a principle, gender responsive strategies acknowledge that gender makes a difference in migrants' experiences and choices, and then responds in order to address gender specific needs and transforms practices to foster gender equality. So this is on the Gender and Migration Hub, which is a different project that we're building this hub with IRCC funding, so it's not BMRC, but it's just a quick visual as to how we're thinking about levels of gender responsiveness and wanting to move away from gender blind or gender biased programming towards gender sensitive analysis where they're taking into account gender needs, gender specific programming where that may be like women only programming, for example, but also moving towards gender responsiveness that is more transformative in its approach. So how well does our settlement system here in Kitchener-Waterloo recognize and respond to these challenges and problems? So in some areas, this is happening more than others. There is some good gender responsive programming, but we consider that maybe it should be made more accessible, more relevant. And so a good practice that we noted in KW was that gender responsive programming on reproductive health at community centers reached many women because it was scheduled to coincide with children's after school activities. And outreach workers, many of whom are more experienced and sometimes de-skilled migrant women, play a crucial role in making this programming accessible to more recent newcomer women. There were also employment programs that existed, but some of these may reinforce stereotypical gender norms. For example, teaching women how to sew. But organizations are innovating and adapting to meet needs. And so the Muslim Social Services is an example of this. They've expanded from offering counseling and mental health services to offer outreach and social assistance. And they do important work in terms of cultural bridging between different communities and the mainstream agencies and educating the public about experiences of Muslims who are coming to our region. But as I mentioned before, much of the programming that we might consider gender responsive is premised on the unpaid or relies on the unpaid or underpaid invisible gendered labor of community volunteers, of migrant women who have not been able to exercise their profession and have been de-skilled and who are stepping up to fill in the gaps. And so here I have a quote from a community center outreach worker who talks about Jay, who is her go-to person when she has temporary people who need clothing or household items. She's so resourceful. She gets this through the community. She doesn't have any government help or funding or budgeting, but the way she works, it's just so important and valuable. To be honest, I think it should not be her job to do these things. She's doing it out of the passion, but I feel it's kind of taking advantage of a good heart of the people in a community when they decide to cut off on funding or stop a program because they say, oh, someone will pick up from the church. So faith groups have an important role, play an important role here in our informal settlement system as well. They run conversation circle programs. They have subsidized summer camps for kids. And often these coincide because as the quote says here from the same person, parents are basically studying, but kids during the summer, they need a program, they need to go places, they can't apply for subsidy. So the church camp is a place where this community outreach worker refers families. So the workshops that we conducted were an effort to start collectively building capacity on gender. Here is an example of a Laurier event, the Uprooted workshop that we held, which involved colleagues outside of the partnership, but was funded by a Shirk Connection grant. However, the participants and partners engaged were the same, and we had been interviewing them as part of the BMRC project. So it was kind of a form of participant observation and substantive engagement with some of these formal and informal immigrant services in the region. So the organizations that have been participating in these kind of workshops have important experiences to build on, but it's important to bring them together purposefully to continue to build this capacity. So what are we aiming for? I already mentioned the Government of Canada's commitment to conducting gender-based analysis in the policy cycle and all government-funded initiatives, which importantly do include immigration and settlement. And here's a graphic that talks about the gender-based analysis plus framework and how they are teaching civil servants to enact it. And there's international guidance as well. Gender responsiveness is a guiding principle in the Global Compact on Migration. This is just to flag the Gender and Migration Hub, which is still under construction. This is a sneak preview. And although it's not a BMRC product, it does inform our work because we're using the tools on the hub to examine the local context of Kitchener-Waterloo and to reflect on the extent to which gender responsiveness is present in the immigrant service landscape. So I'll just leave you with a few of these ideas about how to build on these experiences to create a gender responsive integration infrastructure. It requires participation and consultation of the organizations, including migrant women themselves and their grassroots organizations and initiatives. It requires gender responsive data, building capacity using the GBA Plus training. And we have several recommendations as to social services and gender responsive programming, which are in our research digest. And finally, our takeaway points. We argue in this chapter that in order to support the resilience of newcomers, policy and program must be responsive to their needs. And part of that is being gender responsive, right? So if needs and experiences are gendered, the policy and programmatic response must be gender responsive in order to foster migrant resilience. And there are opportunities to learn from existing experiences of immigrant serving organizations, women, and gender diverse migrants, and also to continue to build capacity to do gender-based analysis in all of the organization's work, but especially those receiving federal funding to do this. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Allison. That's fascinating and a wonderful way to begin this webinar. Our second speaker, we're going to move right along, is Dr. Alexandra Charlotte. And Alexandra is going to talk about civic engagement as a response to economic exclusion among immigrant women in Montreal. Alexandra?
Can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So this project examines the links between civic engagement and the citizenship of immigrants, and especially immigrant women. It explores the political meaning of immigrant women's civic engagement, and then explores how their civic engagement practices relate to their sense of citizenship and how they experience and understand their own citizenship. In this presentation, I am particularly interested in the links between civic engagement of immigrant women in Montreal and their economic citizenship. I look at how the two forms of participation in society are interrelated and interact with each other. I will begin with a brief review of the literature on civic engagement, which I place for this research in the context of citizenship and immigration studies. Next, I will present the data collection methods, and finally some research results. The study of citizenship, understood in its formal or procedural sense, generally takes a top-down perspective. It looks at the institutional and legal systems that govern the relationship between citizens and states. They analyze the laws, rights, and responsibilities linked to citizenship and the forms of protection granted to people who are or are not citizens of the place where they live, as well as their ability to practice political citizenship and how different groups practice it. On the other hand, the study of citizenship as a positioning towards a political entity generally adopts a bottom-up perspective and is interested in the substantive aspects of citizenship: belonging, membership, dynamics of inclusion, exclusion, forms of participation, like economic participation. However, the substantive aspects of citizenship, which refers to the capacity of individuals and social groups to be recognized socially as full citizens and members of society, to act and to be perceived as such, are influenced by several factors that are external to the state and by all the conditions and legal characteristics that define citizenship in different states. So in her book, Genealogies of Citizenship, I like this quote from Margaret Summers. She focuses on the interactions between the state, civil society, and the market. So she focuses on the dynamics of inclusion, exclusion of citizens that result from these dynamics. And she highlights the importance of paying attention to the dynamics that influence individual and more specifically immigrants' substantive citizenship. So substantive citizenship, individuals' ability to act upon the rights and status that are granted to them remain in a certain way independent from their legal status. So immigrants, for example, are granted civil, political, and social citizenship rights relatively and comparatively easily in Canada. However, despite their formal citizenship, equal access to substantive citizenship often requires constant efforts, particularly in the professional and economic areas. As such, authors like Vicky Schultz or Judith Clark and many others discuss the links between economic participation and citizenship, particularly for women. For example, for Judith Clark, paid work is a source of respect and public recognition that must be considered as an essential and fundamental component of substantive citizenship. But as it is very well documented in the literature, universal access to paid employment must be understood in the light of the dynamics of the market in the broad sense, which favors educated and native men over all others, and particularly immigrants and immigrant women. Immigrants, and most importantly, immigrant women, face various obstacles to economic integration. They're more often responsible for managing with family and household matters, finding a school or daycare for the kids, health appointments, paperwork, etc., which delays much of their integration, including language learning and academic credentials and many other things. So as a response to these obstacles, many immigrant women who in Quebec, as well as in the rest of Canada, often have fairly high levels of education, tend to get involved in their communities and in civic, civil society organization as a springboard to paid employment for different reasons, because it helps them improve their language skills, increase their social capital. It helps them familiarize with cultural codes, and it sometimes is recognized as that famous Canadian experience. So in this study, I am interested in the links between civic engagement activities of immigrant women, understood as their involvement in community through civil society organizations, whose objective goes beyond individual and family benefits, and which is to identify and to address issues and problems of social or political nature and their economic integration. My research question broadly is how immigrant women's civic engagement related to their sense of citizenship, and more specifically to their economic citizenship. I conducted semi-structured interviews with immigrant women, 28 of them, from 15 different countries, living in Canada for 3 to 10 years, involved or who were involved in organizations for at least 2 years. So some of them spoke retrospectively about their experience. 15 citizens, 13 permanent residents who cumulated 81 activities in 50 organizations. In the interviews, I was interested in their path. So many of them, as you can see, were involved in many different organizations, or cumulated different activities at the same time, or one after the other. I also was interested in the main reasons for getting involved and the interactions with other activities and other forms of participation, such as economic integration, economic participation, but also academic or things with the kids, or things that prevented them to continue their involvement. So for most participants, civic engagement practiced when they arrive in Canada can be a preparatory activity for entering the labor market. If engagement is in one organization rather than another, does not seem to be linked to the activities that are offered or that they can practice as such. It seems rather to be related to a desire to take an active part in the new society or the new community, with the aim of entering the labor market later. So data show that several participants would have preferred, under conditions permitting, to have a paid job than to become involved in civil society organization. But this decision to get involved is more of a complex thinking than the simple financial benefit of paid employment compared to civic engagement. For most of the women I met, the choice of civic engagement is circumstantial. That is, it is linked to the context of their life at the time they were engaged in the organization. For some, civic engagement allowed them to for greater flexibility in schedule, allow them to be closer to their children during the early years of immigration. For others, engagement activities allowed them to both experience a workplace-like environment and to bring their kids with them. In general, the participants made comments that relate to their engagement practices at the start of their Canadian experience, their early immigration days, and their subsequent economic integration. And this shows a conflict between the two social worlds that are paid employment and civic engagement. The conflict between those two social worlds seems to be moral in nature for some participants and material in nature for others, but for most of them, it is a double bind. In its moral component, the situation can be understood as a conflict which takes place between two different but non-equivalent forms of participation in the whole society, which have different values. The participant seems to place a greater value on a job, particularly considering their own integration. But the moral conflict is often associated with a material conflict, which is embodied in the concrete impossibility to carry out both civic engagement and to assume the responsibilities of paid employment, which is often because of a lack of resources, mental load, time. The analysis also show that the participation of immigrants in community organizations is a defense strategy to face economic integration obstacles. But civic engagement also questions the type of path it represents towards economic integration. Because the activities that the respondents have chosen to practice may not lead to a job which corresponds to their level of qualifications or which is stable. As many authors showed before, civic engagements offers relatively limited perspective, particularly with regard to the integration of a stable or qualified job, when we know that most immigrant women come to Canada with a fairly high level of education. The analysis also showed that civic engagement is used as a long-term strategy of belonging, which says a lot about the role of economic integration in developing a sense of citizenship. Recognition by co-citizens or co-residents as the full citizen does seem to come from taking up paid employment, which is a better recognized form of productive activity. So civic engagement represents, for several women, a response to exclusion from economic citizenship, but also a response to exclusion from social inclusion. It is used to enable them to overcome obstacles to economic integration, but also to foster social integration, which was very important in the data I collected. So this analysis shows in the end that full citizenship and democracy demand that everyone have the same capacity for engaging in decision processes that affect their own life, and that everyone is included in the sense that they can be in contact with a recognized form of economic activity, but that capacity is undermined by the loss of dignity and sense of exclusion from citizenry, which becomes which economic exclusion may foster. And civic engagement may be a way forward, but it also comes with its own challenges.
Alexandra, can you finish?
I'm done.
Ah, parfait. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for speaking in English. I really appreciate it. It's hard to do quickly. Okay, our next speakers are Rupalim Bhuyan from the University of Toronto and Tenzin Chim, who is also from the University of Toronto. And they're going to talk about transformative resilience through migrant-led collective action.
Great, thank you. So we'll do just a brief introduction again. So I'm Rupalim Bhuyan, working in the Faculty of Social Work. Currently in my mother's house in St. Louis, which is the territories of the Osage and Sioux, Sauk, many Indigenous communities at the intersection of the Missouri rivers. So it's just lovely to join you all from here. And then Chimaid, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to speak on our project. Yeah, you can move to the next slide, Pauline.
Sure. So I'll just say briefly, so transformative, well, actually, Shima, you go and then I'll come back.
Okay, so we would like to begin with acknowledging that our research took place on Toronto, a Mohawk term for Toronto, which is a dish with one spoon territory whose original caretakers are the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit people. Personally, as a Tibetan in exile, I feel grateful that we have found a home on this land, but the sad irony of now living on another colonized land benefiting from the colonial project that Canada is, that obligates me to recognize my positionality on this land in relation to the Indigenous people here, its colonization and its decolonization. And I invite folks here today to do the same and think of our responsibilities to this land and people, and think of how we can integrate them in the work that we do. So for today's presentation, we will use this outline to speak about our project and anchor our conversation on transformative migrant resilience. This is going to be a brief presentation, but for those who are interested in learning more, we have a research digest on this project that is available on the BMRC website. We also have 2 research reports coming out really soon, and they'll be distributed very soon. Yeah, next slide.
Great. So, there's so much we can say, but this was a very grassroots research project, and we feel important to recognize there is ongoing and many histories of migrant organizing in the Toronto area. This long history of grassroots organizing is usually not very well documented and is usually not interwoven in our discussions about immigration. So we just want to keep that in mind as like our view of what we were able to pay attention to is just a snapshot of this. We also wanted to link with the city's motto, diversity is our strength. So the City of Toronto mobilizes this as their brand to attract people and many immigrants as well as investors. So we're keeping that diversity as our strength in mind as a kind of political project. In the context of over 50% of the residents of Toronto born outside of Canada, so immigrated in their lifetime. There is also dramatic segregation, racial and economic, just so painfully aware of in the pandemic, as we see the effects of the pandemic are, I'm gonna have to turn off my camera, I think, are particularly hard and life-threatening in these regions. And then as that dovetails as well with different forms of income inequality and precarious work. So these are kind of the backdrop of some of the context of our work, reaching out to migrants, organized communities. We want to spend, although, I think previous presentations, I just hope we can run all of what they said, because we did not integrate as much the gender framework that was talked about, as well as the different forms of citizenship. We really wanted to talk about the inspiration of this project, which was the concept of transformative resilience. I was one of those people on the partnership that was suspicious of resilience and the neoliberal agenda that it is often performing. And this concept of transformative resilience was a way for us to think about the capacity within communities to not only adapt to, but resist systemic inequality facing and envision a world that's otherwise. And this is something I think we were able to capture, and we want to keep that in mind as an overarching framework for this project. We'll come back to that at the end. So this list of research and advocacy goals reflects the kind of collective vision. This was very much a participatory research project. It was initiated by myself and Yogendra, Shakir, the Access Alliance at the time, and many of the community partners who came together identified the need to bring visibility to migrant communities about the structural inequality they're facing. that the research would provide knowledge and support to enable migrant communities to build stronger networks, that there is a need to document this history of community organizing for the next generation, to practice solidarity, or even to learn how to practice solidarity better with other communities. These were things the migrant organizers shared with us as their intention. To also have our research showcase the contributions of migrant communities. I think we often, and myself included, adopt this deficit model that puts ourselves as researchers paying attention to the problems, which we need to do, but we often maybe sideline the incredible assets and strengths, take a Pollyanna view, but really want to see the work they're doing to address these inequalities and help them understand them better. And then, of course, show the transformative dimensions of collective action that go beyond assimilation and civic engagement. And I'd love to return to this in the discussion as well.
So the two case studies of our project are the Tibetan community in Parkdale and South Asian immigrant women in East Stanford. Tibetans are a relatively recent community in Toronto, as majority of them have immigrated to Canada as refugees in the past 15, 20 years. Toronto's Parkdale neighborhood, often referred to as the landing strip for immigrants and refugees due to its affordable housing, hosts the largest concentration of Tibetans in Canada who maintain close ties with each other due to their shared identity and lived experiences of exilehood. Majority of the South Asian immigrant women in East Stanford have immigrated from Bangladesh as economic migrants, and many experience employment barriers after settling in Canada. So South Asian immigrant women organize with other residents by going door to door to introduce themselves, build a sense of community, and empower women through helping them find decent work, childcare, and access to education. So in the summer of 2019, we conducted two focus groups, each with the leaders of the two case study communities. We also conducted 11 in-depth interviews with recognized grassroots community organizers working across the Greater Toronto area. So the migrant leaders that we spoke to in our project, they identified several cross-cutting issues that were shared across migrant communities in the GTA that were related to economic insecurity, racism, barriers in accessing resources and services. And in addition, there were issues that were specific to the communities that we studied. The Tibetan community in Toronto predominantly organizes for the Tibetan freedom struggle against the ongoing Chinese occupation of Tibet. The community leaders also spoke of the psychological toll of exilehood, as well as the urgency to preserve Tibetan culture and language in exile. Precarious immigration status is a pressing concern in the community, as Tibetans who are refused refugee status experience unique precarities due to their statelessness. Among the South Asian immigrant women, underemployment is a key concern shared by many members who, despite holding advanced degrees from their country of origin, face barriers in accessing professional employment in Canada and are forced to take up precarious jobs that are often characterized by unstable work hours, low wages, poor working conditions, and unfair treatment at work. Other key concerns that were shared were gender-based discrimination in the community, Islamophobia, social isolation, and stigma associated with poverty. So we wanted to understand how these migrant leaders that we spoke to first got involved in migrant organizing and what were the motivational factors that kept them engaged. For many migrant organizers, their lived experience of oppression and displacement was a starting point for them in getting involved. There was a sense of responsibility among them to secure a better future for the next generation. One of the common sentiments that we heard from the Tibetan community was, as a Tibetan, I should do something for Tibet, which speaks to the sense of obligation and purpose that people derived from just being a Tibetan. Next slide. So,
sorry, I didn't realize it was set up this way. Now you can see it.
yeah. So those
All
were
right.
some of the themes that came up when we asked people, how did they first get into organizing?
We'll carry on. All right, I turned off my camera, folks, because of my internet. Hopefully you can hear me. This is just one of the things we were trying to understand is how this vision and the organizing goals, how people within these communities connect the concerns they're identifying with their organizing strategies, as well as with the goals of organizing. This is just a snapshot of the sentiment from some of the folks we met, in this case, the South Asian immigrant women we met with. They say in this quote, working as a group to identify from shared experience, to see similarities between our stories, what's good for us, what would be better to do for our future. And this is not necessarily new for those who study community organizing, but you can really see this happening organically, this connection between individual problems and connecting that as a way of understanding the structural conditions that people were facing. This is a snapshot of organizing strategies we identified from the Tibetan community folks we met with. It's not intended to be linear. I need to learn how to use the PowerPoint to take away the line, but this gives you an idea of some of the ways folks mobilized their knowledge, used some, and I use this word carefully, but indigenous forms of gathering. So for example, the kidug is a way that groups have formed in the diaspora to practice mutual aid and practice cultural traditions that are tied to the territories that they were from within Tibet, because it's a diverse territory. And these kidugs became a natural way for people to spread news, to get the word out, to show up, whether it be a rent strike or to raise money. So there are ways in which you tap into these natural networks. There was also ways that the geographic concentration of refugees from Tibet in Parkdale has been an asset. It also has become a site of struggle with gentrification and rising cost of living. So a lot of the activities have been to retain that physical presence because it's been such an important symbol of a home outside of Tibet for folks to gather. So this is just an idea of some of the organizing strategies. We also are playing around with visualizing how these goals and activities are intertwined. This concentric circle is intended to showcase how central the sentiment, how important it is that, you know, ending Chinese occupation of Tibet is to Tibetan identity in the diaspora. And within that overarching goal, almost everything is intertwined, whether that be supporting Tibetans in the diaspora in Canada or in other countries like in India and Nepal, whether it is building community within Canada, and then also addressing the social and economic needs that people have within Canada. And many of the activities that are showcased on the right dovetail into one or more of these overarching goals. I don't want to mean that Free Tibet is the only, but almost every conversation we had, it was vocalized as the primary concern, with some tension between generations or between different folks about where addressing current social, economic, or racial exclusion in Canada fits in. So when we think about substantive citizenship, I'm thinking about Alexandra's talk. Really, this goes beyond a particular nation state and has a much more transnational lens, especially when we think about colonization and ongoing colonization, both here in Turtle Island, as well as Chinese occupation of Tibet. A very different set of goals came out of our conversations with South Asian immigrant women who were organizing with a gender equity lens in mind. You have economic inclusion, you have community engagement and building a new society. Many of the activities had to do with labor conditions, labor rights, minimum wage, childcare, and also creating spaces for women to gather so that their concerns could be better understood and they had that power and strength. So I'm going over this quickly, but we can return to this later. Please, Chime.
So reflecting on some of the impacts of collective actions, migrant organizers shared how there is an increased political consciousness in the community and how people felt empowered after participating in collective actions. And this quotation beautifully captures some of those impacts, and I'll take a moment to read it really fast. People, when they participate in these collective actions, they see the power of many. They see that if we all stand together and we're all together, whether it's occupying somebody's office or blocking traffic or sealing off the Chinese consulate, there is power in numbers. There's strength in numbers, and it would not be the same if it was just one person, whatever the issue is. So I've seen people almost joyful after actions. We laugh, we joke around. You can visibly see people feel empowered if there's such a thing you can see. And when you come together, you realize that we're all connected. We're all affected by the same issues. So I think it makes a huge difference when people do participate in collective actions.
And no, Valerie, I just saw the chat. You want us to end. I'll say very quickly, and you can all look at our research digest. There were some of the lessons we took away, in particular, that we really wanted to look at how transformative resilience is intertwined with individual and community resilience. I don't have the time, but we can come back to it in the Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very, very much, Rupaleen, and you need the whole hour. Each of you needs the whole hour, but since we don't have that much time right now, Jenna, do you want to make a few remarks?
I want to make sure we can hear from folks as well if they have questions for presenters. So let me just point to the fact that in listening to these, I think that there's an interesting number of through lines that's coming out of each of these contexts. And it includes things from thinking about the kind of neoliberal system in which migrants are negotiating migration experiences and access to services, and processes of organizing engagement and claiming substantive citizenship, or trying to engage in forms of substantive citizenship. And I think it's interesting that, across all of them, there's some interesting commonalities around having to organize and having to engage through informal and unpaid work in order to be able to support each other, in order to make claims for rights. And so I think that is telling us that while on the one hand it's a sign of individual resilience, it's also a sign of gaps in terms of institutional resilience. And so I think thinking about how those interplay together and thinking about the crucial role that women are playing, and how complex that is, because it certainly doesn't come without cost. So I'll flag that, and then I'll ask people to weigh in with some questions and comments to presenters. We only have a few minutes left, and we'd love to hear from folks in the audience. I'm sure you have questions, and try to direct them towards an individual. It always helps.
Any questions or comments? None? I do.
Of course you do.
I always have questions and comments. Okay, I agree with everything everyone said, and particularly what Jenna said. But what I hear is 3 presentations saying that a group of women, in part because of their migrant status, which ranges from the most temporary to permanent status and even citizenship, but that migrant status is associated with a lack of material resources and power. And what you're all calling for is for those migrants to take advantage of their own agency. So if I was being a devil's advocate, I would say, isn't this blaming the victim? I just thought I would say it. You can all disagree with me
I'll
now.
respond
Go
quickly.
for it.
I would respond quickly to say that it's the racism and the perception that they are not knowledge holders and that they're not able to influence is the struggle. So I don't think our efforts to showcase capacity is a way of saying, they're not able to showcase it enough. They need to work harder. I think it's more, they would call the media and the media would not show up. They would with the MPs, they had already done research and written a very sophisticated report, and the MP disregards their comments because politically it's not viable. So I think the power inequities are the responsibility of the society because of the systemic racism that people are facing, that they're showing up for these temp jobs, maybe for an hour's worth of work. It costs them more to cover their children's childcare, and then they don't even get paid that day. Those are the structural inequalities that need to be addressed for their power to really, we'll be able to tap into it in a different way and have a very different society.
Sheem, have you got one sentence of comment? Because I want Alexandra to say something as well, and then we'll finish with Allison.
Yeah, I just wanted to, so we didn't really get time to talk about that, but our research sort of documents the resiliency of these migrant communities in adapting and overcoming the adversities, but also challenging these inequities. It is also really important for us to keep the spotlight on the inequities that they are experiencing, because when we spoke with the migrant leaders, they spoke about how, yeah, we're doing all these organizing work, but there are so many barriers that they were experiencing in supporting their community. And a lot of those barriers were sort of indicative of the lack of access to resources and services that they could use to support their community. So it's like, while we highlight the amazing work that they're doing, it's also important to recognize the sort of backdrop of why they're doing this work.
Perfect. Alexandra, have you got anything you'd like to say?
No, I agree with Rupalim, but in my case, it's more about the individual resilience. So it's and I obviously didn't have time to talk about all this political sense of that they don't give to their civic engagement, which is a very interesting topic, but it's another one. So I didn't have time to address it. But in many cases, I found that if it's not in the context of an ethnocultural association or something that is a context like that one, it is very rare that that immigrant women consider or conceptualize their engagement as a political action or a way to change things. It is rather a way forward to look like the others or do like the others, and this says a lot about the importance they give to having a paid job and not talking too loud.
Good point. Allison, the last word.
Well, I think we're using different terms to talk about the same kinds of people in these communities who are migrant women who may or may not have achieved a permanent residency or citizenship, who are filling in the gaps. And so the very exercise of their agency in becoming outreach workers, in providing the childcare so that other women can access services, is flagging where the community resilience and where the service provision is perhaps failing. And so if we are to move from being gender sensitive towards gender responsiveness, or transformative resilience, to use Rupalim's term, then we need to recognize the crucial work that they're doing and make it well remunerated, and not just piggyback on their unpaid labor and continue to exploit.
Perfect. And on that note, since I see no questions, I want to thank all the presenters for a really fascinating set of presentations. And I want to thank you as an audience. This is the first of these webinars, so we'll get the timing sorted out more. We may only have 2 presentations next time at this rate. I can see the number diminishing. And I hope that you will join us a week from now, same time, same place. We're going to talk about international students and some very interesting research about ways to promote the resilience of those international students. Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing. Take care, everyone.
No, it was great. I really appreciate hearing about your work, guys. It's really valuable, particularly for me, John, and Tara. It gives us a much better idea of what's going on. So thank you. And I think lots of people will really enjoy listening to the little segments. And I'm sorry I couldn't give you more time. I'm going to think about this some more.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.